Now, just to get at this concept I mentioned before of positive and negative liberty, try to consider these two situations here. And let me just kind of give you an overview. So in situation one, you basically have some people sitting around a table. There's a nice chest with water bottles, and one person, Anne, is passing out the bottles. There's enough bottles to go around, but she decides, I'm not going to give it to these two, to Kurt and Joanne. And there's no reason given, right? We don't know why, and we're assuming Kurt and Joanne weren't mean, they didn't do anything bad. They just weren't given the bottles. There was enough, and they didn't get them. Now compare that to the second situation, where you basically have a kid getting picked on. Right? He doesn't feel comfortable fighting back because he's outnumbered, and he's just trying to eat his lunch, and he's being unfairly, one could say, interfered with. Now, both of these situations, there's some level of unfairness. The question is, how would you describe or characterize the different ways? It's not the same type of unfairness, though. There's a difference, right? One type of unfairness is kind of more direct, and one type of unfairness is more of a lack of doing something, right? One type of unfairness comes from a failure to do something. The other type of unfairness comes from an interference with somebody else, with something else. So maybe you want to pause it for a minute to think about that difference, so that you can try to kind of get to the core of that difference. But ultimately, what the difference describes is what I mentioned before: the difference between positive liberty and negative liberty. So in the first scenario, the scenario where the bottles are not passed out to the people, even though there's enough to go around and they didn't do anything that should have restricted them from getting those bottles, the bottles weren't given out. So the fact that there was enough to go around and they didn't receive what was due to them, since everyone else got one, that was an example of restricting positive liberty, right? Of basically saying, you're not getting, everyone else is getting this stuff distributed to them, you're thirsty, but you're not getting it, right? That's a restriction that's the way the fairness was restricted. It was the positive liberty that was restricted. But in the second case, in the second example, there wasn't anything that wasn't being given to Felix that was the problem. It's rather, the problem is that he's being interfered with or messed with. So that, in that case, it was Felix's negative liberty that was being infringed upon. Now, there are some people who argue that negative liberty is the most fundamental liberty, that is the most fundamental to all cultures, by the way. Right? I don't care how communal you consider yourself to be, or how outgoing and how much you love people. If someone gets in your space, you're going to feel that, and you're going to want them to be away, right? Either you're going to physically push them, or you're going to say, hey, get out of my space. Right? Nobody likes their immediate personal space invaded. And I mean, unless it's somebody you're dating, that's different. But in terms of just your everyday life, your space being invaded, nobody likes that. And so that's why a lot of philosophers have argued that that is a fundamental right, the right to be left alone and to not have your space interfered with. And people like Rand and other libertarians argue that because that is a fundamental right, that is the only right that the government should have its hands in defending. And we'll talk about how they argue we should defend that right later. So let me just make this clear that, again, situation one, where the bottles aren't being passed out, that's an example of restricting positive liberty. And example two, where Felix is being messed with, that's an example of restricting negative liberty. And both of them are wrong, one could argue, in different ways. Now, Marx's beliefs identify much more with positive liberty, because Marx is saying that people need certain things guaranteed by the government, just like those people should have had the bottles guaranteed by I forgot who I said, by Anne, right? So what sort of features would somebody who's a socialist like Marx argue should be guaranteed by the government? Well, obviously what we already have in our country: fire, police, schooling. I mean, Marx certainly would have said all college should be covered, which people have argued for recently in our country. But Marx would also add healthcare and many other services. The government should, in food, housing, things like that, the government should be providing people with all these things so they don't have to worry about, in Marx's case, earning money to get them later and then going through the whole capitalist treadmill. Rand, on the other hand, her view connects with negative liberty because she thinks the government should only serve very limited purposes. In particular, like most libertarians, she believes the government should serve purposes like defending people's right, the use of force. The government should have a monopoly on the use of force. So in other words, if there's a battle, people are fighting, the government should be able to come in with a police force and break up that situation. So libertarians still believe that we should have police, national police. Libertarians also believe that we should have a national army, military, but not for war. Right? This is a big difference between libertarians and other Republicans, because Republicans tend to say they want minimal government, but they tend to be in favor of intervention in other countries too. They tend to be in favor of wars, just like many liberals actually are as well. Libertarians say no. Libertarians are completely against intervention in other countries. Rand Paul, a senator who identifies as libertarian, who's technically registered Republican, he identifies as libertarian. He's been one of the few who has argued that we should pull back from the Middle East multiple times, sticking, at least in that case, to his libertarian principles. Rand Paul also has a famous quote that I think I cite in the Reader, where he says, "I want a government so small you can barely see it." So for Rand, she's in favor of negative liberty, and the government should only serve the functions not of giving stuff to people, like Marx believes with positive liberty, but Rand thinks the government should just prevent people from harming you. They should prevent people from getting in your space. And the last function that libertarians believe a government should serve is a justice system. So they're fully aware that there's going to be disputes between people, and they argue that we need a reasonable justice system to adjudicate those disputes. So monopoly on the use of force for military, only for defense against invasion, and for police force, and then a judicial system. And that's it. That's pretty much the only function of government. Now, to be fair, everyone's different. Different libertarians will add certain things in and restrict certain things. So I'm not saying all libertarians see it that way, but that is definitely a core central view of many libertarians, that it should serve those basic purposes. Just briefly looking at the beginning of the trend of libertarianism in our own country, a lot of people go back and they look at philosopher John Locke, and I mentioned John Locke in the when we talked about philosophy of science in the readings, and Locke had his hands in a lot of different things, but he wrote a lot about politics, and he was actually very influential on our founding fathers in the creation of some of their founding documents. And I have a specific example here. The famous phrase that everyone knows, "Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," comes from the Declaration of Independence. It was actually first written by John Locke in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson later modified what Locke said into the Declaration of Independence. So when Locke said it, he said, "Civil interests," he means rights, same idea. "Civil interests I call life, liberty, health, and the possession of outward things, such as money, lands, houses, furniture, and the like." And in the context of the letter, he's basically saying these are the things that people have a right to, right? These things. And what's interesting is he said property, right? He said we have a right to property. But Jefferson presumably thought that was a little too direct and made it more general and said, no, you have a right to happiness. But either way, the central point behind life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that is negative liberty, right? That's the idea, is that's what the American dream means. You come here to pursue your happiness, to not be restricted when you do that, to not be controlled. That's why some people who come from more repressive governments come here, because they see our government as being less restrictive in that way. By the way, just to briefly go back to negative and positive liberty, you'll notice that in our own system, we have a mix of the two, right? And there's some people who say, look, it's not one or the other. They're both important. It's important to provide people with things, and it's important to not mess with people too, to not restrict their freedom. So for instance, we already have socialist programs, like the police force in our country. It's socialized. You don't have to pay when the police come to deal with a call. Fire is part of our tax dollars. Where we disagree on, what we've had disagreements over culturally is something like Obamacare. where some people say it shouldn't exist and other people say it should. That would, of course, be a positive liberty. But rights like the First Amendment, or the Second Amendment even, those are based on negative liberty. The right to free speech, to be able to say what you want as long as you're not harming someone else and having the government not tell you to stop saying that. That's a right to negative liberty, right? To kind of do your own thing without interference. Same with the right to bear arms, right? I can have a gun, I can own a gun without someone telling me what to do with my property, especially the government. So we have a mix of negative and positive rights, even if liberals tend to lean a little bit more towards positive and conservatives a little more towards negative. But the people we're looking at are more on the extremes, right? Marx was clearly on the side of mainly positive rights, whereas Rand is clearly on the side of negative rights.